So let's look at some more pieces of legislation that had to do with the New Deal. So let's deal with jobs and some aid that was handed out by the, or handed up by the New Deal legislation in FDR's administration. So in 1933, unemployment was at 25%. So 1 in 4 people in this country were unemployed. That's astounding. That's a huge number. Think about how much we were horrified by the fact that unemployment was 10% just a few years ago. So 25%. Civilian Conservation Corps, their job was to work in conservation areas, so reforestation, stopping wildfires, dealing with floods, that sort of thing. These were young men, 18 to 25-year-olds. There were 3 million young men employed by the CCC over the years that it existed. So huge difference there. And these were groups of men who would leave their homes, go and stay in camps near where they were needed, and that's where they would live. They didn't necessarily travel from home every day. They would leave their families, which is why they had to be young men, according to the legislation. So they weren't leaving kids of their own, they were leaving mom and dad, essentially. The Federal Emergency Relief Act, FERA, is led by Harry Hopkins, and that gives money for federal projects all over the country. It gives it to states, gives it to corporations, whatever is necessary to start up some projects to get people working again. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, this is money for farmers. And what had happened is since World War I, when crops were really in need to go overseas and feed the troops, now we had all this surplus. We were producing so much stuff because of the new machinery, the gas-powered machines and plows and combines and so forth, that farmers were overproducing. And prices, supply and demand, prices went down. So the goal here is to bring prices back to the pre-World War I level. That means raising prices, getting them back up again so farmers could make money. Otherwise, they were burning corn for fuel because it was easier and cheaper. And that goes back to the cartoon, if you remember on the last test, where it showed the guy cutting up the corn to be burned because he didn't need coal. He needed fuel, and so he could use the corn for fuel. Encourage farmers to leave land unplanted. So, in other words, don't plant everything you have, because if you do, you're going to overproduce. So we will supplement you, we'll give you money to not plant all your land. They still do that today. They still write checks to farmers to hold back on their farming. Now, there's more help in the terms of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They are going to offer mortgages, particularly refinancing mortgages at a better interest rate for homeowners so that they can save a little money every month. Civil Works Administration offers temporary jobs. These are basically seasonal jobs. So when it snows, you shovel the snow. When it's springtime, we plant some things. Seasonal jobs that go along with this, very temporary in nature though. Works Progress Administration, more jobs here, okay? And this is going to be led by Harry Hopkins as well. So the projects that are created from FERA also go to the Works Progress Administration. The Public Works Administration, that's going to be led by a man named Harold Ickes, or Ikes, not really sure. And they start 34,000 projects across the United States that have to be completed. Those can be highway jobs or any type of other building. The Grand Coulee Dam was built as a result of the Public Works Administration, so big deal. Now, is everybody a fan of the New Deal? No. The New Deal definitely had their detractors, people who didn't like the New Deal. 3 of those people are here. Father Coughlin, he's from Michigan. He's a priest, Catholic priest in Michigan. And he writes about urging the government to engage in social justice. And he doesn't believe that doing these mass public administration, public legislation type of work, he doesn't believe that that is social justice. That social justice should be more about the individual and the rugged individualist that Hoover talked about, rather than this sort of socialist kind of plan that, as he saw it, being divvied out by Roosevelt. Huey Long was from Louisiana, and he writes about every man a king. And he basically says that every man in America has the power to be a king if they want it. They just have to show some initiative. And then Dr. Francis Townsend, he says, he proposes a plan in California that calls for every elderly person to get $200 a month. Well, that's more than Social Security would have given them. However, here's the catch. They have to spend it within the month. They couldn't save anything. And so what are we encouraging here? He was no fan of the New Deal or Roosevelt's either. Now, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, this is not the National Rifle Association, okay, this is different. National Recovery Administration is probably the most sweeping piece of labor legislation ever passed in this country. It was big. It was a huge deal. It's going to affect industry, labor, and the unemployed. Now, it's only in existence for a few years because this is one of the pieces that the Supreme Court shot down. Supreme Court's going to shoot down 7 of 9 New Deal pieces of legislation that come before it. This is one of them. So the Schechter case shoots down the NRA. It no longer exists after that. Unconstitutional, but some of the gains made by the NRA stay in place for the long haul. So what are the gains for labor? Well, how does Roosevelt sell this to everybody? For labor, he says this is the positive for you. You have the right to organize into unions. We're going to ban any anti-union contract, so companies can't make you sign a document that says I'm not going to join a union. You have a right to collectively bargain as a union, as a group. You can bargain together for new terms in a contract, as long as the other side agrees. We're going to establish minimum wage and maximum hours, so 40 cents an hour, 40 hours a week. Done. And we're going to implement some safety regulations for to protect child labor, make sure they don't get harmed. Now, what do businesses get? Because if you're going to sell this to both sides, you better have something for both sides. Businesses get a loophole, and that allows for price fixing, something that was not allowed under any antitrust legislation that existed before. Sherman antitrust. This allows for price fixing so companies can make more money and guarantee their earnings. Now, the Dust Bowl happens in late 1933, and what happens with the Dust Bowl is there's this huge drought that affects the Mississippi River Valley or the Mississippi Great Plains, and it's going to sweep up, the winds get really high, and they start sweeping up all this black topsoil from the land, and it's like dust in the air. Actually wipes out the view of the sun for days on end. So really dank, dark conditions. Who's affected by the Dust Bowl? Missouri, Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Tens of thousands of men are going to hit the road to move to another place. Where do they move to? California. Where do they move from? Well, they're called the Okies and the Arkies. They move from Oklahoma and Arkansas in large numbers to make their way out to California to better the lives of their families and make more money. We see this portrayed in, many of you probably read it, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Okay, is where they talk about the Okies and the Arkies and heading out to California. Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, that's going to encourage Native Americans to establish localized governments on their reservations and to continue to practice their culture and heritage on those reservations. So it was an effort to sort of appease the Native Americans, to let them know that we did value them, we valued their heritage, and we wanted to make sure they had a safe place to reestablish those connections. The Securities and Exchange Commission, this was a protection for investors on Wall Street. So because of all the shady misdealings on Wall Street previously, what the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, is charged with doing is making sure none of that shadiness exists. None of the backroom deals, none of the insider trading. So its job is to regulate Wall Street. They wanted to take Wall Street and make it more of a place of honest trading of stocks versus gambling, where you threw a bunch of money on something and you hope that horse wins the race. That's not what they wanted. They wanted to make sure that things were done legally and with good perspective on being fair to everyone.